Welcome back to Nightfall Sleep Radio. We are currently working our way through an 1880s book by E.M. Berens called The Myths and Legends of Ancient Greece and Rome. Mr. Berens wrote extensively about ancient Greek gods and goddesses, and he compared them to their Roman counterparts. In tonight's episode, we'll look at the major Olympian goddesses, starting with Pallas-Athene. If you've missed any of the episodes in this series, there's a full playlist listed on the channel where you can listen to them as they're recorded and uploaded. Now let's get started. Pallas-Athene, goddess of wisdom and armed resistance, was a purely Greek divinity. That is to say, no other nation possessed a corresponding conception. She was supposed, as already related, to have issued from the head of Zeus himself, clad in armor from head to foot. The miraculous advent of this maiden goddess is beautifully described by Homer in one of his hymns. Snow-capped Olympus shook to its foundation, and the glad earth re-echoed her martial shout. The billowy sea became agitated, and Helios, the sun god, arrested his fiery steeds in their headlong course to welcome this wonderful emanation from the godhead. Athena was at once admitted into the assembly of the gods, and henceforth took her place as the most faithful and sagacious of all her father's counselors. This brave, dauntless maiden, so exactly the essence of all that is noble in the character of the father of gods and men, remained throughout chaste in word and deed, and kind at heart, without exhibiting any of those failings which somewhat mar the nobler features in the character of Zeus. This direct emanation from his own self, justly his favorite child, his better and purer counterpart, received from him several important prerogatives. She was permitted to hurl the thunderbolts, to prolong the life of man, and to bestow the gift of prophecy. In fact, Athena was the only divinity whose authority was equal to that of Zeus himself, and when he ceased to visit the earth in person, she was empowered by him to act as his deputy. It was her special duty to protect the state and all peaceful associations of mankind, which she possessed the power of defending when occasion required. She encouraged the maintenance of law and order, and defended the right on all occasions, for which reason, in the Trojan War, she espoused the cause of the Greeks, and exerts all her influence on their behalf. The Areopagus, a court of justice where religious causes and murders were tried, was believed to have been instituted by her, and when both sides happened to have an equal number of votes, she gave the casting vote in favor of the accused. She was the patroness of learning, science, and art, more particularly where these contributed directly toward the welfare of nations. She presided over all inventions connected with agriculture, invented the plow, and taught mankind how to use oxen for farming purposes. She also instructed mankind in the use of numbers, trumpets, chariots, and presided over the building of the Argo, thereby encouraging the useful art of navigation. She also taught the Greeks how to build the wooden horse, by means of which the destruction of Troy was effected. The safety of cities depended on her care, for which reason her temples were generally built on the citadels, and she was supposed to watch over the defense of the walls, fortifications, and harbors. A divinity who so faithfully guarded the best interests of the state by not only protecting it from the attacks of enemies, but also developing its chief resources of wealth and prosperity, was worthily chosen as the presiding deity of the state, and in this character, as an essentially political goddess, she was called Athena Polias. The fact of Athena having been born clad in armor, which merely signified that her virtue and purity were unassailable, has given rise to the erroneous supposition that she was the presiding goddess of war. But a deeper study of her character, in all its bearings, proves that, in contradiction to her brother Ares, the god of war, who loved strife for its own sake, She only takes up arms to protect the innocent and deserving against tyrannical oppression. It is true that in the Iliad we frequently see her on the battlefield, fighting valiantly and protecting her favorite heroes. But this is always at the command of Zeus, who even supplies her with arms for the purpose, as it is supposed that she possessed none of her own. A marked feature in the representations of this deity is the aegis, that wonderful shield given to her by her father as a further means of defense, which when in danger she swung so swiftly round and round that it kept at a distance all antagonistic influences. Hence her name was Pallas, from Pallo, I swing. In the center of this shield, which was covered with dragon scales, bordered with serpents, and which she sometimes wore as a breastplate, was the awe-inspiring head of the Medusa, which had the effect of turning to stone all beholders. In addition to the many functions which she exercised in connection with the state, Athena presided over two chief departments of feminine industry, spinning and weaving. In the latter art, she herself displayed unrivaled ability and exquisite taste. She wove her own robe and that of Hera, which last she is said to have embroidered very richly. She also gave Jason a cloak wrought by herself, and he set forth in quest of the golden fleece. Being on one occasion challenged to a contest in this accomplishment by a mortal maiden named Arachne, whom she had instructed in the art of weaving, she accepted the challenge and was completely vanquished by her people. Angry at her defeat, she struck the unfortunate maiden on the forehead with a shuttle which she held in her hand, and Arachne, being of a sensitive nature, was so hurt by this indignity that she hung herself in despair, and was changed by Athena into a spider. This goddess is said to have invented the flute, upon which she played with considerable talent, until one day, being laughed at by the assembled gods and goddesses for the contortions which her countenance assumed during these musical efforts, she hastily ran into a fountain in order to convince herself whether she deserved their ridicule. Finding to her intense disgust that such was indeed the fact, she threw the flute away and never raised it to her lips again. Athena is usually represented fully draped. She has a serious and thoughtful aspect, as though replete with earnestness and wisdom. The beautiful oval contour of her countenance is adorned by the luxuriance of her wealth of hair, which is drawn back from the temples and hangs down in careless grace. She looks the embodiment of strength, grandeur, and majesty, whilst her broad shoulders and small hips give her a slightly masculine appearance. When represented as the war goddess, she appears clad in armor with a helmet on her head, from which waves of a large plume. She carries the aegis on her arm, and in her hand a golden staff, which possessed the property of endowing her chosen favorites with youth and dignity. Athena was universally worshipped throughout Greece, but was regarded with special veneration by the Athenians, she being the guardian city of Athens. Her most celebrated temple was the Parthenon, which stood at the Acropolis at Athens, and contained her world-renowned statue by Phidias, which ranks second only to that of Zeus by the same great artist. This colossal statue was 39 feet high and was composed of ivory and gold. Its majestic beauty formed the chief attraction of the temple. It represented her standing erect, bearing her spear and shield, and in her hand she held an image of Nike, and at her feet there lay a serpent. The tree sacred to her was the olive, which she herself produced in a contest with Poseidon. The olive tree, thus called into existence, was preserved in the temple of Erechtheus on the Acropolis, and it is said to have possessed such marvelous vitality that when the Persians burned it after sacking the town, it immediately burst forth into new shoots. The principal festival held in honor of this divinity was the Panathenea. The owl, cock, and serpent were the animals sacred to her, and her sacrifices were rams, bulls, and cows. Minerva. The Minerva of the Romans was identified with Pallas-Athene of the Greeks. Like her, she presides over learning and all useful arts, and is the patroness of the feminine accomplishments of sewing, spinning, weaving, etc. Schools were under her special care, and schoolboys, therefore, had holidays during her festivals, the Greater Quintaria, when they always brought a gift to their master, called the Minerval. It is worthy of notice that the only three divinities worshipped in the capital were Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva, and in their joint honor the Lundi Maximi, or Great Games, were held. Themis. Themis, who has already been alluded to as a wife of Zeus, was the daughter of Cronus and Rhea, and personified those divine laws of justice and order by means of which the well-being and morality of communities are regulated. She presided over the assemblies of the people and the laws of hospitality. To her was entrusted the office of convoking the assembly of the gods, and she was also mistress of ritual and ceremony. On account of her great wisdom, Zeus himself frequently sought her counsel and acted upon her advice. Themis was a prophetic divinity and had an oracle near the river Cephaeus in Boeotia. She is usually represented as being in the full maturity of womanhood, of fair aspect, and wearing a flowing garment which drapes her noble, majestic form. In her right hand she holds the sword of justice, and in her left the scales, which indicate the impartiality with which every cause is carefully weighed by her, her eyes being bandaged so that the personality of the individual should carry no weight with respect to the verdict. This divinity is sometimes identified with Tyche and sometimes with Anunnaki. Themis, like so many other Greek divinities, takes the place of a more ancient deity of the same name who was a daughter of Uranus and Gaia. This older Themis inherited from her mother the gift of prophecy, and when she became merged into her younger representative, she transmitted to her this prophetic power. Hestia. Hestia was the daughter of Cronus and Rhea. She was the goddess of fire in its first application to the wants of mankind. Hence, she was essentially the presiding deity of the domestic hearth and the guardian spirit of man. And it was her pure and benign influence which was supposed to protect the sanctity of domestic life. Now, in these early ages, the hearth was regarded as the most important and most sacred portion of the dwelling, probably because the protection of the fire was an important consideration. For if once permitted to become extinct, reignition was attended with extreme difficulty. In fact, the hearth was held so sacred that it constituted the sanctum of the family, for which reason it was always erected in the center of every house. It was a few feet in height and was built of stone. The fire was placed on top of it and served the double purpose of preparing the daily meals and consuming the family sacrifices. Around this domestic hearth or altar were gathered the various members of the family, the head of the house occupying the place of honor nearest the hearth. Here, prayers were said and sacrifices offered, and here also every kind and loving feeling was fostered, which even extended to the hunted and guilty stranger, who, if he once succeeded in touching this sacred altar, was safe from pursuit and punishment, and was henceforth placed under the protection of the family. Any crime committed within the sacred precincts of the domestic hearth was invariably visited by death. In Grecian cities, there was a common hall called the Priantheum, in which the members of the government had their meals at the expense of the state. And here, too, was the Hestia, or public hearth, with its fire, by means of which those meals were prepared. It was customary for emigrants to take with them a portion of this sacred fire, which they jealously guarded and brought with them to their new home, where it served as a connecting link between the young Greek colony and the mother country. Hestia is generally represented standing, and in accordance with the dignity and sanctity of her character, always appears fully draped. Her countenance is distinguished by a serene gravity of expression. Vesta. Vesta occupies a distinguished place among the earlier divinities of the Romans. Her temple in Rome, containing it, as it were, the hearthstone of the nation, stood close behind the palace of Numa Pompilius. On her altar burned the never-ceasing fire, which was tended by her priestesses, the Vestal Virgins. The temple of Vesta was circular in form and contained that sacred and highly prized treasure of the Palladium of Troy. The great festival in honor of Vesta, called the Vestalia, was celebrated on the 9th of June. Demeter. Demeter, from Demeter, or Earth Mother, was the daughter of Cronus and Rhea. She represented that portion of Gaia, the whole solid earth, which we call the earth's crust, and which produces all vegetation. As goddess of agriculture, field fruits, plenty, and productiveness, she was the sustainer of material life, and was therefore a divinity of great importance. When ancient Gaia lost, with Uranus, her position as a ruling divinity, she abdicated her sway in favor of her daughter Rhea, who henceforth inherited the powers which her mother had previously possessed, receiving in her place the honor and worship of mankind. In a very old poem, Gaia is accordingly described as retiring to a cavern in the bowels of the earth, where she sits in the lap of her daughter, slumbering, moaning, and nodding forever and ever. It is necessary to keep clearly in view the distinctive difference between the three great earth goddesses, Gaia, Rhea, and Demeter. Gaia represents the earth as a whole, with its mighty subterranean forces. Rhea is the productive power which causes vegetation to spring forth, thus sustaining men and animals. And Demeter, by presiding over agriculture, directs and utilizes Rhea's productive powers. But in later times, when Rhea, like other ancient divinities, loses her importance as a ruling deity, Demeter assumes all of her functions and attributes, and then becomes the goddess of the life-producing and life-maintaining earth crust. We must bear in mind the fact that man in his primitive state knew neither how to sow nor how to till the ground. When, therefore, he had exhausted the pastures which surrounded him, he was compelled to seek others which were as yet unreaped. Thus, roaming constantly from one place to another, settled habitations and consequently civilizing influences were impossible. Demeter, however, by introducing a knowledge of agriculture, put an end, once and forever, to that nomadic life which was now no longer necessary. The favor of Demeter is believed to bring mankind rich harvests and fruitful crops, where her displeasure caused blight, drought, and famine. The island of Sicily was supposed to be under her special protection, and there she was regarded with particular veneration, the Sicilians naturally attributing the wonderful fertility of their country to the partiality of the goddess. Demeter is usually represented as a woman of noble bearing and majestic appearance, tall, matronly, and dignified, with beautiful golden hair which falls in rippling curls over her stately shoulders, the yellow locks being emblematical of ripened ears of corn. Sometimes she appears seated in a chariot drawn by winged dragons. At others she stands erect, her figure drawn up to its full height and always fully draped. She bears a sheaf of wheat ears in one hand and a lighted torch in the other. The wheat ears are not unfrequently replaced by a bunch of poppies, with which her brows are also garlanded, although sometimes she merely wears a simple ribbon in her hair. Demeter, as the wife of Zeus, became the mother of Persephone, to whom she was so tenderly attached that her whole life was bound up in her, and she knew no happiness except in her society. One day, however, whilst Persephone was gathering flowers in a meadow, attended by the ocean nymphs, she saw to her surprise a beautiful narcissus, from the stem of which sprang forth 100 blossoms. Drawing near to examine this lovely flower, whose exquisite scent perfumed the air, she stooped down to gather it, suspecting no evil, when a yawning abyss opened at her feet, and Hades, the grim ruler of the lower world, appeared from his depths, seated in his dazzling chariot drawn by 4 black horses. Regardless of her tears and the shrieks of her female attendants, Aeetes seized the terrified maiden and bore her away to the gloomy realms over which he reigned in melancholy grandeur. Helios, the all-seeing sun god, and Hecate, a mysterious and very ancient divinity, alone heard her cries for aid, but they were powerless to help her. When Demeter became conscious of her loss, her grief was intense, and she refused to be comforted. She knew not where to seek for her child, but feeling that repose and inaction were impossible, she set out on her weary search, taking with her 2 torches which she lighted in the flames of Mount Etna to guide her on her way. For 9 long days and nights she wandered on, inquiring of everyone she met for tidings of her child. But all was in vain. Neither gods nor men could give her the comfort which her soul so hungered for. At last, on the 10th day, the disconsolate mother met Hecate, who informed her that she had heard her daughter's cries, but knew not who it was that had borne her away. By Hecate's advice, Demeter consulted Helios, whose all-seeing eye nothing escapes, and from him she learned that it was Zeus himself who had permitted Aeetes to seize Persephone and transport her to the lower world in order that she might become his wife. Indignant with Zeus for having given his sanction to the abduction of his daughter, and filled with the bitterest sorrow, she abandoned her home in Olympus and refused all heavenly food. Disguising herself as an old woman, she descended upon the earth and commenced a weary pilgrimage among mankind. One evening she arrived at a place called Elysius in Attica, and sat down to rest herself near a well beneath the shade of an olive tree. The youthful daughters of Celeus, the king of the country, came with their pails of brass to draw water from this well, and seeing that the tired wayfarer appeared faint and dispirited, they spoke kindly to her, asking who she was and whence she came. Demeter replied that she had made her escape from pirates who had captured her, and added that she would feel grateful for a home with any worthy family, whom she would be willing to serve in a menial capacity. The princesses, upon hearing this, begged Demeter to have a moment's patience while they returned home and consulted their mother, Metanira. They soon brought the joyful intelligence that she was desirous of securing her services as a nurse to her infant son, Demephon, or Triptolemus. When Demeter arrived at the house, a radiant light suddenly illuminated her, which circumstance so overawed Metanira that she treated the unknown stranger with the greatest respect and hospitality, offered her food and drink. But Demeter, still grief-worn and dejected, refused her friendly offers and held herself apart from the social board. At length, however, the maid-servant Diambe succeeded, by means of playful jests and merriment, in somewhat dispelling the grief of the sorrowing mother, causing her at times to smile in spite of herself, and even inducing her to partake of a mixture of barley meal, mint, and water, which was prepared according to the directions of the goddess herself. Time passed on, and the young child throve amazingly under the care of this kind and judicious nurse, who, however, gave him no food, but anointed him daily with ambrosia, and every night laid him secretly in the fire in order to render him immortal and exempt from old age. But unfortunately, this benevolent design on the part of Demeter was frustrated by Metanira herself, whose curiosity one night impelled her to watch the proceedings of the mysterious being who nursed her child. When to her horror she beheld her son placed in the flames, she shrieked aloud. Demeter, incensed at this untimely interruption, instantly withdrew the child, and throwing him on the ground, revealed herself in her true character. The bent and aged form had vanished, and in its place there stood a bright and beauteous being, whose golden locks streamed over her shoulders in richest luxuriance, her whole aspect bespeaking dignity and majesty. She told the awestruck Metanira that she was the goddess Demeter, and had intended to make her son immortal, but that her fatal curiosity had rendered this impossible, adding, however, that the child, having slept in her arms, had been nursed on her lap, should ever command the respect and esteem of mankind. She then desired that a temple and altar should be erected to her on a neighboring hill by the people of Eleusis, promising that she herself would direct them how to perform the sacred rites and ceremonies which should be observed in her honor. And with these words she took her departure, never to return. Obedient to her commands, Celeus called together a meeting of his people and built the temple on the spot which the goddess had indicated. It was soon completed, and Demeter took up her abode in it. But her heart was still sad for the loss of her daughter, and the whole world felt the influence of her grief and dejection. This was indeed a terrible year for mankind. Demeter no longer smiled on the earth she was wont to bless, and though the husbandmen sowed the grain and the groaning oxen plowed the fields, no harvest rewarded their labor. All was barren, dreary desolation. The world was threatened with famine, and the gods with the loss of their accustomed honors and sacrifices. It became evident, therefore, to Zeus himself that some measures must be adopted to appease the anger of the goddess. He accordingly dispatched Iris and many of the other gods and goddesses to implore Demeter to return to Olympus. But all of their prayers were fruitless. The incensed goddess swore that until her daughter was restored to her, she would not allow the grain to spring forth from the earth. At length, Zeus sent Hermes, his faithful messenger, to the lower world with a petition to Aedes, urgently entreating him to restore Persephone to the arms of her disconsolate mother. When he arrived in the gloomy realms of Aedes, Hermes found him seated on a throne, with the beautiful Persephone beside him, sorrowfully bewailing her unhappy fate. On learning his errand, Aedes consented to resign Persephone, who joyfully prepared to follow the messenger of the gods to the abode of life and light. Before taking leave of her husband, he presented to her a few seeds of pomegranate, which in her excitement she thoughtlessly swallowed, and this simple act, as the sequel will show, materially affected her whole future life. The meeting between mother and child was one of unmixed rapture, and for the moment all the past was forgotten. The loving mother's happiness would now have been complete had not Aedes asserted his rights. These were, that if any immortal tasted food in his realms, they were bound to remain there forever. Of course, the ruler of the lower world had to prove this assertion. This, however, he found no difficulty in doing, as Asclepius, the son of Acheron and Orphene, was his witness to the fact. Zeus, pitying the disappointment of Demeter at finding her hopes thus blighted, succeeded in effecting a compromise by inducing his brother Aedes to allow Persephone to spend 6 months of the year with the gods above, whilst during the other 6 she was to be the joyless companion of her grim lord below. Accompanied by her daughter, the beautiful Persephone, Demeter now resumed her long-abandoned dwelling in Olympus. The sympathetic earth responded gaily to her bright smiles. The corn at once sprang forth from the ground in fullest plenty. The trees, which were seared and bare, now donned their brightest emerald robes, and the flowers, so long imprisoned in the hard, dry soil, filled the whole air with their fragrant perfume. Thus ends this charming story, which was a favorite theme with all of the classic authors. It is very possible that the poets who first created this graceful myth merely intended it as an allegory to illustrate the change of seasons. In the course of time, however, a literal meaning became attached to this and similar poetical fancies, and thus the people of Greece came to regard as an article of religious belief what in the first instance was nothing more than a poetic simile. In the temple erected to Demeter at Eleusis, the famous Eleusinian mysteries were instituted by the goddess herself. It is exceedingly difficult, as in the case of all secret societies, to discover anything with certainty concerning these sacred rites. The most plausible supposition is that the doctrines taught by the priests to the favored few whom they initiated were religious truths which were deemed unfit for the uninstructed mind of the multitude. For instance, it is supposed that the myth of Demeter and Persephone was explained by the teachers of the mysteries to signify the temporary loss which Mother Earth sustains every year when the icy breath of winter robs her of her flowers and fruits and grain. It is believed that in later times a still deeper meaning was conveyed by this beautiful myth, vis-a-vis the doctrine of the immortality of the soul. The grain, which as it were remains dead for a long time in the dark earth, only to rise one day, dressed in newer and lovelier garb, was supposed to symbolize the soul, which after death frees itself from corruption, to live again under a better and purer form. When Demeter instituted the Eleusinian mysteries, Celeus and his family were the first to be initiated, Celeus himself being appointed a high priest. His son, Triptomolius, and his daughters, who acted as priestesses, assisted him in the duties of his sacred office. The mysteries were celebrated by the Athenians every 5 years, and were for a long time their exclusive privilege. They took place by torchlight and were conducted with the greatest solemnity. In order to spread abroad the blessings which our agriculture confers, Demeter presented Triptolemus with her short chariot drawn by winged dragons, and giving him some grains of corn, desired him to journey through the world, teaching mankind the arts of agriculture and husbandry. Demeter exercised great severity toward those who were incurred of her displeasure. We find examples of this in the stories of Stellio and Eurystheon. Stellio was a youth who ridiculed the goddess for the eagerness with which she was eating a bowl of porridge, when weary and faint in the vain search for her daughter. Resolved that he should never again have an opportunity of thus offending, she angrily threw into his face the remainder of the food, and changed him into a spotted lizard. Orestheon, son of Triopas, had drawn upon himself the anger of Demeter by cutting down her sacred groves, for which she punished him with a constant and insatiable hunger. He sold all of his possessions in order to satisfy his cravings, and was forced at last to devour his own limbs. His daughter Metra, who was devotedly attached to him, possessed the power of transforming herself into a variety of different animals. By this means she contrived to support her father, who sold her again and again each time she assumed a different form, and thus he dragged on a pitiful existence. Ceres. The Roman Ceres is actually the Greek Demeter under another name, her attributes, worship, festivals, etc., being precisely identical. The Romans were indebted to Sicily for this divinity, her worship having been introduced by the Greek colonists who settled there. The Ceralia, or festivals in honor of Ceres, commenced on the 12th of April and lasted several days. Aphrodite. Aphrodite, from Aphoros, sea foam, and Dite, issued, was the daughter of Zeus and a sea nymph named Dione, and was the goddess of love and beauty. Dione, being a sea nymph, gave birth to her daughter beneath the waves, but the child of the heaven-inhabiting Zeus was forced to ascend from the ocean depths and mount to the snow-capped summits of Olympus in order to breathe that ethereal and most refined atmosphere which pertains to the celestial gods. Aphrodite was the mother of Eros, the god of love, also of Aeneas, the great Trojan hero, and the head of that Greek colony which settled in Italy, and from which arose the city of Rome. As a mother, Aphrodite claims our sympathy for the tenderness she exhibits toward her children. Homer tells us in his Iliad how when Aeneas was wounded in battle, she came to his assistance, regardless of personal danger, and was herself severely wounded in attempting to save his life. Aphrodite was tenderly attached to a lovely youth called Adonis, whose exquisite beauty has become proverbial. He was a motherless babe, and Aphrodite, taking pity on him, placed him in a chest and entrusted him to the care of Persephone, who became so fond of the beautiful youth that she refused to part with him. Zeus, being appealed to by the rival foster mothers, decided that Adonis should spend 4 months of every year with Persephone, 4 with Aphrodite, whilst the remaining 4 months he should be left to his own devices. He became, however, so attached to Aphrodite that he voluntarily devoted to her the time that was his own disposal. Adonis was killed during a chase by a wild boar, and to the great grief of Aphrodite, who bemoaned his loss so persistently that Aides, moved with pity, permitted him to pass 6 months of every year with her, whilst the remaining half of the year was spent by him in the lower world. Aphrodite possessed a magic girdle, the famous cestius, which she frequently lent to unhappy maidens suffering from the pangs of unrequited love, as it was endowed with the power of inspiring affection for the wearer, whom it invested with every attribute of grace, beauty, and fascination. Her usual attendants are the Charities or Graces, who are represented undraped and intertwined in a loving embrace. In Hesiod's Theogony, she is supposed to belong to the more ancient divinities, and whilst those of later date are represented as having descended one from another, and all more or less from Zeus, Aphrodite has a variously accounted for yet independent origin. The most poetical version of her birth is that when Uranus was wounded by his son Cronus, his blood mingled with the foam of the sea, whereupon the bubbling waters at once assumed a rosy tint, and from their depths arose, in all the surpassing glory of her loveliness, Aphrodite, goddess of love and beauty. Shaking her long fair tresses, the water drops rolled down into the beautiful seashell in which she stood, and became transformed into pure, glistening pearls. Wafted by the soft and balmy breezes, she floated on to Cytherea, and was thence transported to the island of Cyprus. Lightly she stepped on shore, and under the gentle pressure of her delicate foot, the dry and rigid sand became transformed into a verdant meadow, where every varied shade of color and every sweet odor charmed the senses. The whole island of Cyprus became clothed with verdure, and greeted this fairest of all created beings with a glad smile of friendly welcome. Here she was received by the seasons, who decked her with garments of immortal fabric, encircling her fair brow with a wreath of purest gold, whilst from her ears depended costly rings, and a glittering chain embraced her swan-like throat. And now, arrayed in all this panoply of her irresistible charms, the nymphs escort her to the dazzling halls of Olympus, where she is received with ecstatic enthusiasm by the admiring gods and goddesses. The gods all vied with each other in aspiring to the honor of her hand, but Hephaestus became an envied possessor of this lovely being, who, however, proved as faithless as she was beautiful, and caused her husband much unhappiness, owing to the preference she showed at various times for some of the other gods, and also for mortal men. The celebrated Venus of Milo, now in the Louvre, is an exquisite statue of this divinity. The head is beautifully formed. The rich waves of hair descend on her rather low but broad forehead, and are caught up gracefully in a small knot at the back of the head. The expression of the face is most bewitching and bespeaks the perfect joyousness of a happy nature combined with the dignity of a goddess. The drapery falls in careless folds from the waist downward, and her whole attitude is the embodiment of all that is graceful and lovely in womanhood. She is of medium height, and the form is perfect in its symmetry and faultless proportions. Aphrodite is also frequently represented in the act of confining her dripping locks in a knot, whilst her attendant nymphs envelop her in a gauzy veil. The animals sacred to her were the dove, swan, swallow, and sparrow. Her favorite plants were the myrtle, apple tree, rose, and poppy. The worship of Aphrodite is supposed to have been introduced in Greece from Central Asia. There is no doubt that she was originally identical with the famous Astarte, the Ashtoreth of the Bible, against whose idolatrous worship and infamous rites the prophets of old hurled forth their sublime and powerful anathemas. Venus. The Venus of the Romans was identified with the Aphrodite of the Greeks. The worship of this divinity was only established in Rome in comparatively later times. Annual festivals, called Veneralia, were held in her honor, and the month of April, when flowers and plants spring forth afresh, was sacred to her. She was worshipped as Venus Cloquina, or the Purifier, and as Venus Myrtea, or the Myrtle Goddess, an epithet derived from the myrtle, the emblem of love. Thank you for listening to Nightfall Sleep Radio. We hope you've enjoyed this journey with us through the stories of E.M. Berens. Please consider subscribing to hear more soft-spoken stories and sounds to help you drift to sleep. Until next time, sleep well and good night.